Hello, guys. Happy whatever day it is you are watching this. We are going over the next lesson, and last lesson we talked about the nullification crisis. This lesson we are going to take aim at another one of Andrew Jackson's domestic policy, talking about the Bank of the United States. So we are talking about the Bank of the United States. And many times you'll hear me say BUS. That's an acronym for the Bank of the United States. And if you notice on my annotated outline on the website, the first section is crossed off because, yeah, that's interesting stuff, but not like the most interesting, the most important stuff. So we are going to start in the section known as called the bank, and we are going to go from there. So the bank. One area of in particular concern among bankers, businessmen, and governmental leaders was banking on the frontier. Frontier land was cheap, and speculators would buy large tracts, expecting the price to go up as settlers entered the region. In order to finance their investment, speculators borrowed as much as they could from wildcat banks that sprang up to cater to this demand. These banks were themselves often speculative in nature, being more interested in making a fast dollar than building a secure banking business. The excessive loan practices caused many more banknotes to be in circulation in the United States than there were deposits to cover them. Hard-pressed banks were sometimes forced to suspend these banknotes, these species. Species are known for gold and silver. Payments to depositors and note holders wanting to withdraw gold and silver coins. Confidence in banknotes dropped, causing them to lose value, and more of them were needed to purchase the same amount of goods. So, as people moved west, they bought land at cheap prices, right? And these wildcat banks would pop up to nourish that demand. So, what ended up happening was that these banks, these wildcat banks, would run out of resources. So a similar situation of unstable currency, because that's what we are really talking about right now, unstable currency, had existed after the Revolutionary War. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury, proposed a national bank that would issue banknotes of stable value. Among other benefits, Hamilton felt such a bank would be tie the interest of the wealthy to the interest of the government, and therefore to Americans in general. The federal government would supply one-fifth of the new bank's initial capital, much of it in government bonds. Private investors would supply the other four-fifths. After much debate, Congress created the first Bank of the United States, and President Washington signed it into law amid grave misgivings in 1791. Thomas Jefferson opposed the bank, saying it vastly extended what was specified in the Constitution, and that it opened a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. Hamilton countered that the power to charter corporations was inherent in government, and that the Constitution authorized Congress to pass any laws necessary and proper for execu- carrying into execution. So this loose interpretation of the Constitution. The bank's charter ran out in 1811 and was allowed to lapse because of a turn of the political tide in favor of strict construction, as well as deep concerns over the large proportion of British ownership in the bank. Absence of the central bank hurt trade and hampered the war efforts in 1812. So we are dealing with an issue of unstable currency. And the reason the Bank of the United States exists was the political powers that be believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So we are at 1812 right now. And the bank is probably not going to succeed. Inflation and the risk-taking behavior of foreign frontier banks threatened the nation's financial stability. Frontier banks were beyond the regulatory reach of the state banks, however, because the state banks had no means to compel banks outside their states to exchange their notes for gold and silver coins. In addition, on the frontier, there was no cooperative network of banks to ensure sound practices as there was from one state to another. The situation prompted the federal government to charter the second Bank of the United States. So all this financial instability when it came to frontier banks, the federal government was kinda pressured to chartering the second Bank of the United States in 1816. Like state banks and the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States was privately owned. All federal funds were deposited in the bank, making it a powerful source of investment capital. And its federal charter extended its reach throughout the states into the frontier. The government intended that the bank's size and consistent practices would help regulate and speculative for frontier banks. So the second Bank of the United States was there to support and gain momentum for the frontier banks. Unfortunately, the first managers of the Second Bank of the United States did not understand its role in the economy. Almost immediately, the bank fell into practices of over-exceeding credit, giving out way too much in credit, especially among its western branches, which loaned 10 times more banknotes than it had gold and silver on deposit. For several years, a boom in the frontier land values masked the danger to the country. But in 1819, land values declined and many frontier borrowers were unable to make their loan and mortgage payment. Wildcat banks were unable to meet their obligation, which created financial difficulties for their creditors and depositors. So we begin to see what actually caused the Panic of 1819. So the Panic of 1819 was because of the instability of these banks in the West, giving out way too much credit. And when it was time to get that credit back, the banks were like, shit, we don't have gold and silver to give you. Okay. The Panic of 1819 caused many businesses failures and was a general hardship for a great number of people. For their 3 years it continued. The Second Bank of the United States had badly overexceeded credit, and many of its loans had defaulted in the panic, nearly causing it to fail. Only by taking the severest measures did it remain solvent. To save itself, the bank refused to extend credit to smaller banks that were also financially in trouble. These banks, in turn, were forced to implement drastic measures such as calling in loans and foreclosing on mortgages in order to stay afloat. Though these steps saved the financial structures and the institutions that supported the economy, they were hard on many individuals and businesses and even caused failures among banks. Consequently, public opinion was critical of the Second Bank of the United States in the aftermath of the panic. In addition, many state banks felt that their authority to regulate credit within the state was threatened by a national bank, such as the Second Bank of the United States. The State Bank of Maryland persuaded Maryland legislatures to impose a tax on out-of-state banks, including the Second Bank of the United States. So, we all know the story from a couple lessons ago. The case of McClellan versus Maryland. The court ruled in favor of McClellan in writing the majority opinion. Marshall stated that a power to create implies a power to preserve. By this he meant that the government had the right to exercise its power and authority to protect an entity that it has legally created. Marshall went on to say the power to tax involves the power to destroy, by which he conveyed the court's opinion that a state government had no authority to exercise destructive powers over a legitimate and constitutional entity created by the federal government and chartered by the federal government. Another significant aspect of the McClellan case was Marshall's defining the doctrine of loose construction of the Constitution. Loose construction allows the government to act outside what is specifically stated in the Constitution. Previously, many people, particularly Jefferson and the Republicans, had insisted on strict construction, whereby the federal government is confined to do exactly what is expressly stated in the Constitution, no more and no less. Marshall argued, however, that the Constitution was derived from the consent of the people, and this allowed the government to act for the people's benefits. He also stated that the tenets of the Constitution were not strictly set, but were adaptable to morally wrong, were within the bounds of the intent of the Constitution. Often using Hamilton's exact words, Marshall's argument for a broad interpretation of the Constitution expanded the powers of the federal government. My APUSH teacher said when we did a big discussion on strict versus loose construction of the Constitution, my teacher said, you know how much of the federal government wouldn't exist right now if we followed a strict interpretation of the Constitution? Many of our current lawmakers believes in this loose interpretation of the Constitution. So see you guys in the next lesson part when we talk about Jefferson, when we talk about Jackson and the Bank War. See you guys then.